Okay, we are going to start. Good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is journalism, and I've been very fortunate in my career that I actually knew that guy.
You actually knew?
I actually knew Richard Nixon, and I'm going to tell you how in a couple of minutes. Anyway, August 9th, 1974 was the day that Nixon resigned as President of the United States. He is the only president ever to resign, and he resigned because of Watergate, and that would be success for Gerald Ford. Also in 1974, I know some of you had to be in front of the TV watching what was going on with this woman, Patty Hearst, right? You were there, she was kidnapped and all that other stuff. How many of you waited online to get gas?
I did.
Yeah, you waited online to get gas. Were you odd or even?
Odd, I think.
You were odd. That meant you could get gas on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Right, so you were odd. Anybody even? Because you get gas, and I forgot what happened on Sunday. How many of you used to chew juicy fruit gum? You loved it, loved it. Well, it made history because in Ohio, it was checked out by a cashier and she didn't have to put the numbers in the cash register. Universal barcode was on that product. Haile Selassie's rule of Ethiopia ends, ending his family's rule of Ethiopia after 704 years. Willy Brandt is kicked out as the chancellor in West Germany. There was a bloodless coup in Portugal, but that's besides the point. That's Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon is running for re-election in 1972. And the name of his re-election committee is this: the Committee for the Re-election of the President, short, CREEP. 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 That is what it was called. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Nixon. I met him for the first time in 1985, 29 years old. And there was the dispute between the Major League Baseball umpires and the Major League owners. And they're getting nowhere in their negotiation, absolutely nowhere in the negotiations. There's a guy by the name of Richie Phillips. He's the head of the Umpires Association. And he lived in Philadelphia. And he lived Society Hill in Philadelphia. And his next door neighbors were David and Julie Eisenhower. Okay? So he would see Dick Nixon every Friday night, every Saturday, because they would drive down from Park Ridge, New Jersey to Philadelphia to babysit the grandkids. And can you imagine Richard Nixon babysitting a grandkid? Let me make this perfectly clear. I want you to pick those toys up, or I'm going to punish you. Anyway, there's an impasse. And so Richie Phillips, who is an attorney, calls up Peter Ueberroth, who is the commissioner of Major League Baseball, and says, hey, you know what? Everything's failing. Why don't we go to arbitration? And Peter Ueberroth, the baseball commissioner, says, well, who do you got in mind? Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon, get out of here. How do you know him? He's next door right now babysitting the kids. I want that mess cleaned up right now. So, to make a long story short, the Major League owners say, okay, we're going to use Dick Nixon as our arbitrator. And I get a call from Gene Orzer, who is the assistant executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. He says, what are you doing this afternoon? I said, not much, babysitting, actually, which is what I was doing. It was my day off. He says, how'd you like to hang out with Dick Nixon? I said, Dick Nixon, get out of here. He said, no, he's the arbitrator between the umpires and the owners, and we as the Baseball Association, we have a vested interest in what's going on between the owners and the umpires. And besides, you work for NBC Radio, so why don't you just come down with us? So I go down there, and Gene is there, and a guy by the name of Arthur Shack, the late Arthur Shack, he's also part of it. I got to get a chair here, because I have to show you this, because it's easier to do than explaining this to you. So anyway, we go down to Nixon's office, which was at Foley Square, Southern District Court was across the street. He's in Foley Square, across the street. He's got an office on the 3rd or 4th floor. So we get there. It's me, Gene, and Arthur. And we walk in and we see the secretary at the desk. And she says, well, Mr. Nixon's not here right now, but why don't you go in his office? Okay, that sounds okay. So we go in his office and we look around. It was the miniature Oval Office. He had pictures of him and Sadat, him and Mao Zedong, him and Brezhnev, him and Eisenhower. He had flags all over the place. But all three of us are looking at the desk saying, should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? And then I said, we are. I sat down just like this. Too bad there was no cell phones in these days. And I went just like this. I'm not a crook! I'm not a crook! Okay, so Arthur is the next one there. I'm not a crook. And Gene, if we had cell phones back in those days, I'd have 170 different videos of me saying, I'm not a crook. That is, then Nixon walked in, and that's where my relationship with the guy, the committee for the re-election of the president, CREEP, started. Why was Nixon messing around with Watergate? Well, he had some good reasons. The Vietnam War in 1972, and we're talking about the 1972 re-election. Well, Vietnam was still going. Anybody protest the Vietnam War back in the day? Yeah, she did. Where?
Too young.
No, she did. Where'd you protest?
I was in Ohio.
You were in Ohio. Well, you weren't far from Kent State.
The other end of the state.
You're on the other, but Kent State was a major protest in 1970. So the American economy was in a mess. In the 1970 midterms, the Democrats won the popular vote in House races by 8.7% while adding a dozen seats. In 1971, Nixon's approval ratings dipped below 50%, and that's a problem for an incumbent president. Now, I'm going to show you this autograph of Dick Nixon, Richard Nixon. And you really can't see it from there, but this is an index card, right? And I figured, well, you know what? He's president of the United States. You know, he may be disgraced, but it's got to be worth something. So, Mr. President, can you sign my index card? Well, he does. He takes this index card. If you want to notice something here, it's on a straight line. You see it's on a straight line? Yes. He takes the index card, puts it on the table, right? Edge of the table, then takes out a little ruler, and then signs it on top of the ruler, and then puts the X in there. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really, really strange, really strange. But there's an even stranger component here for me, because I was 16 in 1972 when the Watergate break-in took place. Nixon, of course, broke in, but who was the recipient? It was Larry O'Brien, who I got to know as the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, and that was a Christmas gift that he gave me and a whole bunch of others, a basketball with Lawrence O'Brien's signature on the old brown basketball. Now, you want a John Kennedy story that you've never heard? Do you want a JFK story you've never heard? Okay, Lawrence O'Brien was part of that Boston Mafia with Kenny O'Donnell and Powers and Pierre Salinger. Remember Pierre Salinger? And Ted Sorensen, who actually wrote all of Kennedy's speeches and wrote his book. And one day, my friend, the late Mark Schneider from the Associated Press, goes out to breakfast with O'Brien, and for some reason, O'Brien tells him the story about the morning of the assassination, November 22nd, 1963. And they're all at the Texas Hotel, Fort Worth, and JFK can't sleep, really can't sleep. And he's going to meet with the crowd in the morning, and then he's going to be giving a talk to the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, then go over to Dallas, where he had another speech that he was going to give. This was the third day of a campaign swing through Texas. Anyway, so it's about 5:30 in the morning, and Larry O'Brien gets a call, President wants to see you. And what he wanted to do, and what he did, was go up to the roof of the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth with Secret Service men, and they're walking around just talking about nothing in general, and all of a sudden JFK turns to Larry O'Brien, he's looking at the horizon, and he says, you know what? They want to get me. They keep getting me. 7 hours later, Anyway, so that's Lawrence O'Brien, and he was head of the Democratic National Committee. After Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson kept him on as the liaison to Congress for Johnson. That's G. Gordon Liddy, who made a ton of money in radio and TV, but he was the general counsel for CREEP. CREEP, right? General counsel for CREEP. In January 1972, G. Gordon Liddy says, hey, you know what? The boss is having some problems here. His ratings aren't all that good, and we're worried about Edmund Muskie. Remember Edmund Muskie? He was supposedly going to be the 1972 Democratic nominee. So he says, hey, let's burglarize them. Let's put wiretaps on Larry O'Brien and all that. This is the general counsel of CREEP, a lawyer, and he's saying, let's commit a burglary. Why? Well, remember Daniel Ellsberg? Yeah, Pentagon Papers. Remember him? Well, in 1971, the Pentagon Papers came out and basically accused the government of lying to people about Vietnam. Well, Nixon's a little upset about that. So he organizes this group called the Plumbers. Oh, they're plumbers, because plumbers fix leaks or create leaks. So he gets this together, and they decide we got to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. Why don't we break into his psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles? They break into the psychiatrist's office. They get a file cabinet. They break into the file cabinet looking for Ellsberg's psychiatric records. So these guys are ready. Hey, their criminals are ready, so why not? Why don't we bug the Watergate complex in Washington? And there is Larry O'Brien. And I said to O'Brien one day, I said, why'd they pick on you? He said, because they were looking for dirt. I said, how much dirt did you have? He said, as much as they wanted. They weren't able to get away with it. So there is Larry. On November 17th, they commit the crime. Wiretaps are placed on the telephone of the Democratic National Chairman, Larry O'Brien, and the Executive Director of Democratic States Chairman, R. Spencer Oliver, Jr. On June 17, 1972, Frank Wells, a security guard at the Watergate complex, called police at 1:30 in the morning. 5 men are arrested inside of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Well, it's a story, but it's also a burglary. You say, well, that big a deal. Well, it wasn't until it was. On June 18, 1972, Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Baker, James W. McCourt, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis are charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of telephone and other communications. Well, Woodward and Bernstein. I identify with Carl Bernstein. I was the guy in the streets. I was the guy who did the interviews. I was never in the studio or inside the newsroom. Bernstein was the guy in the streets. Woodward was a Yale graduate, and he thought about everything he wrote, and it was painstaking for him to write to make sure he had every I dotted and every T crossed. Perfect for each other. Woodward was forced to do quicker things by Bernstein, and every one of Bernstein's instincts was put down by Woodward, so they worked rather well together. The real heroes of Watergate aren't these two guys. The real heroes of Watergate are Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, and Ben Bradley, who was the executive editor. Because at any point, especially early, they could have just pulled the plug and nobody would have known much about this burglary. But they let Woodward and Bernstein loose. Now, it looks like Jimmy Hoffa on that paper. Might be. So anyway, they're young guys then. They're still around today. On June 19, 1972, the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein revealed that one of the Watergate burglars was James McCourt, a Republican Party security aide. Follow the money. Follow the money. Remember that? Follow the money. Here's McCourt, Watergate figure. In June and July, a Woodward and Bernstein source called Deep Throat. Remember Deep Throat?
Yes.
Deep Throat, who ended up being Mark Felt, tells them, follow the money. Follow the money. And they start. with the burglar's account that showed a link to the 1972 Creep Committee to re-elect the president through its subordinate financial committee. Well, the election would come down to this: Richard Nixon against George McGovern. Edmund Muskie was not anywhere to be seen. McGovern, who is the senator from South Dakota, ended up facing Richard Nixon. He's out on the campaign trail. There he is. Only one arm up, though. On August 22nd, 1972, Nixon has a news conference. And in the news conference, he's asked about, well, what do you know about Watergate? And this is what he said. I can say categorically that no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed was involved in this very bizarre incident. Okay, so you weren't involved. I don't know. Wasn't me. Wasn't me. Only a face a mother could love. Call me Dick. Okay, let me tell you the story about Call Me Dick. One day I see Nixon. This is about 1987, and I see Nixon, and I said, "Oh, Mr. President, how you doing?" No, Evan. Please call me Dick. Call me Dick. Afterwards, it was always, "Hi, Dick." Hi, Dick. Do you know he traveled, at least in New York and in New Jersey, without Secret Service protection that he was entitled to as an ex-president? No bodyguards. No Secret Service people around him. He'd walk the streets. I'd see him walk the streets. You'd see people say, "Hey, Nixon, how you doing?" And didn't faze him at all. No, he had no protection walking the streets. But if you had a face like that, you think you need protection? On August 30th, Nixon announced that White House counsel John Dean has completed an internal investigation into the Watergate break-in, and guess what he found? Wasn't us. We're off the hook. Somebody else. We don't know these people. Oh, we're in the clear. Yeah, we're in the clear now because John Dean said we're in the clear. But these guys are still digging up dirt. Look how young they were back then. These two guys were obscure guys in the newsroom. They were not stars, but they would become stars. On September 29, 1972, the Washington Post reports that Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, once controlled a secret fund to finance intelligence gathering against the Democrats. Whoops. When Bernstein calls Mitchell for a comment, Mitchell threatens Bernstein and Katharine Graham, who's the publisher of the Post. Guess what they did? They published the threat. The war is on. So much so that the Washington Post owned the TV station, and Nixon called the Federal Communications Commission to see if he could get the TV station license yanked from the Washington Post. And there's Muskie. And Muskie was supposed to be the one, but he never went. He never got there. In October 1972, Woodward and Bernstein report that the FBI had made connections between Nixon's aides and the Watergate break-in. Woodward and Bernstein described the existence of a major dirty tricks campaign against Muskie, orchestrated by Donald Segretti. Creep was involved, and Nixon's private attorney. On November 7th, Nixon wins. He takes 49 of 50 states. There are 51 jurisdictions that have electoral college votes. Only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia went for McGovern. Nixon won 49 of 50 states, got 520 electoral votes, got 61% of the popular vote, and beat McGovern by nearly 18 million votes. Well, that should be the end of it, right? The American people have spoken. They're not worried about Watergate. Let's get on. But everybody in Washington knew there would be trouble ahead in 1973, starting with the plumbers. And the plumbers' trial starts on January 8th, and 5 defendants plead guilty. Liddy and McCourt are convicted after the trial. This is probably the most corrupt person ever to be the acting director or director of the FBI. His name is L. Patrick Gray, and he is supposed to go before the Senate to get ratified to replace J. Edgar Hoover as the head of the FBI. It is February 28, 1973, And Gray testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee during his nomination to replace Hoover. Armed with newspaper articles indicating the White House had possession of FBI Watergate files, the committee chairman, the North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin, questioned Gray as to what he knew about the White House obtaining the files. Guess who got the files? He did, and he shared it. Anyway, and there is Ervin. Gray stated he had been given FBI reports, or he gave FBI reports to Dean, and he discussed the FBI investigation with Dean on many occasions. It also came out that Gray had destroyed important evidence entrusted to him by Dean. Gray's nomination failed, and Dean was directly linked to the Watergate cover-up. There is James McCourt. He has a lot of problems with him going to jail, or him going to jail. And on March 19, 1973, he sent a letter to Judge John J. Sirica, who was a Republican. And he says, well, you know, me and the other guys, we were pressured into pleading guilty. And we were told to remain silent. And perjury was committed, and others were involved. And he said that the pressure came from John Dean and the former Attorney General John Mitchell. Well, there is G. Gordon Liddy. He would be sentenced as well. On March 23rd, 1973, the 5 Watergate burglars, along with Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, were sentenced with a stiff fine and a maximum prison time of up to 40 years. So Richard Nixon is looking at John Dean, and he says, hey, John, why don't we go to Camp David? We'll go to Camp David. You know, Camp David's named after my son-in-law. It's in Maryland. And it's really nice. And you and I, we could, I don't know, sit around in our underwear and scratch and drink a beer and watch a basketball game. Why don't you come up here? Well, there was more to it, of course. And there is Camp David. And John Dean said, yeah, I'll go. On March 22nd, Nixon requested that John Dean put together a report with everything he knew about the Watergate matter, and let's go to Camp David together. Well, Dean does go to Camp David. He starts the report, and he says, man, they're going to hang me for this. I'm going to be the scapegoat. I can't do this report. Well, he doesn't do the report. And he starts to thinking about, what kind of criminal liability do I have in this thing? And it turns out, he has a lot. And there is John Dean. It's April 6, 1973, and Dean hires an attorney and begins his cooperation with the Senate Watergate investigators, but he doesn't quit Nixon. Not yet. He's burning both ends of the candle. He's working for Nixon, and he's giving information to the Senate Watergate investigators. And he's not going to tell this to Nixon, at least not on April 6th. Dean continued to provide information to the prosecutors who were making enormous progress on the cover-up. They didn't even look at the cover-up, they just looked at the break-in. Now, well, let's see what happened afterwards. We kind of get an understanding there was a break-in, and we need to know why there was a break-in, but we need to know, was the cover-up worse than the crime? There is H.R. Haldeman, Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman. Dean had asked Nixon, hey, give me some immunity here. Come on, give me some immunity. After all, look at what I've done for you. No, John, we're not doing that. You're on your own. And with that, John Dean is like, I'm really on my own here. What am I supposed to do? Well, he makes his decision. On April 19, 1973, I'm not going to be the scapegoat for the Watergate scandal. Word was passed on by associates of John Dean that he is ready to implicate Ehrlichman and Haldeman in the case. Please call me Dick. Please call me Dick. I'm going to give you another story about Dick Nixon. You want another story about Dick Nixon, oddball story? There was a guy by the name of Barry Halper. Barry Halper was the 1% owner of the New York Yankees and had the biggest baseball memorabilia collection outside of Cooperstown, and maybe even more so. Had a lot of money. And I was doing this talk a couple of years ago, a Zoom talk for a place in Florida, and his sister happened to be in the audience, and she had never heard this story. Anyway, Barry Halper, and I witnessed this, Barry Halper, it's at Yankee Stadium, is carrying around baseballs. And he sees President Nixon. He says, Mr. Nixon, President Nixon, President Nixon. My name's Barry Halper. I said, I know who you are. And he says, can I get an autographed baseball? Couldn't use the ruler on the baseball. Couldn't use the ruler on the baseball. Can you believe that he signed an autograph with a ruler? Anyway, so he hands Nixon the ball. He said, oh, by the way, Mr. President, I usually have people sign with their nicknames. And Nixon looks at him with that face. You mean Tricky Dick? Yeah! Be lucky with what you get. I got the autograph, but not Tricky Dick. And so it's April 30th, 1973, the White House announced the resignations of the Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, and the presidential aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and Nixon fires John Dean. Afterwards, he says, it's my fault. I take the responsibility. Kind of, but at that point he does. I solemnly swear to tell the truth about everything I know about Watergate and Dick Nixon, and that is John Dean. On June 25th, 1973, he began his testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee. He was given use immunity. In his testimony, he implicated the administration officials, including Nixon fundraiser and the former Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon, and himself. So he said, Nixon, this is the first time we find out that Nixon was involved in what was going on. That's an average everyday tape recorder from that era, 1979, complete with the numbers here, so when you edit, you know where to go back, where the voices that you want. And it's not a particularly great tape recorder, but it does its job. This would be the tape recorder that would be the undoing of Richard Nixon. In February 1971, a sound-activated taping system is installed in the Oval Office, and that included the Oval Office desk to capture audio transmitted by telephone taps and concealed microphones. During the transition, back in late 1968 and 69, from the Johnson administration to the Nixon administration, Lyndon Johnson said, you ought to tape all your conversations in the Oval Office. They may come in handy one day. They did. The system was expanded to include other rooms within the White House and Camp David. Taping system was confirmed by the committee's staff member, Donald Sanders, on July 13th, 1973, during an interview with the White House aide, Alexander Butterfield. Butterfield is one of the few people that is still alive from this, with Woodward and Bernstein and a couple other, at that point, very young prosecutors. But Butterfield is still around. And there is Alexander Butterfield. 3 days later, it was made public during the televised testimony of Butterfield when he was asked about the possibility of a White House taping system by the Senate counsel Fred Thompson, who became an actor and then became a senator from Tennessee. Hey, by the way, how many of you have watched the Match Game with Gene Rayburn? Like it?
He used to come to my shop to buy papers years ago.
Oh, Gene Rayburn?
Yeah,
he's a nice guy from what I heard.
Yeah, I know. But
Yeah. Anyway, the Match Game was supposed to start in September 1973, but it was delayed. It was a more important program on CBS, the Watergate hearings. So this is it. It's the original tape recorder. Nothing fancy, nothing at all. It was just an average, everyday tape recorder, and it's a museum piece now. On July 26, 1973, the committee subpoenaed several White House tapes after the president had refused to surrender them. The accuracy of Dean's testimony was confirmed by the tapes. Uh-oh, the walls start caving in. This is Archibald Cox. He is the special prosecutor in the case. He is a Harvard law teacher, He used to be the Solicitor General of the United States, and he takes on the role of investigating what happened with Watergate. He clashed with the White House over Nixon's refusal to release over 10 hours of secret Oval Office recordings. They're my tapes. They're not yours. They're mine. I made them. You shouldn't have them. Well, anyway, some of those tapes implicated Nixon as part of the break-in. Let me say this about that. Let me make this perfectly clear. This was a bizarre incident. Anyway, it is October 20th, 1973, Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon fired the special prosecutor Archibald Cox and accepted the resignations of the Attorney General Elliot Richardson and the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelhaus. And there is Richardson. He ain't going to do the job. And there is Ruckelhaus. He ain't going to do the job. Somebody else is going to have to fire him. So, well, that left, Richardson resigned. Ruckelhaus said, I'm out of here. That left Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, as the highest ranking official in the Justice Department. Bork carried out Nixon's order and dismissed Archibald Cox. And there is Robert Bork. Anybody watch The Simpsons? Yeah. Does that look like the judge on The Simpsons? Because it is.
Wasn't he the U.S. Attorney General in the 80s?
No, Supreme Court. He was nominated for the Supreme Court, but we'll get to that later. The reaction to the firing and resignations would force Nixon to appoint another special prosecutor to replace Cox, and now it is becoming more and more and more complex, this whole crime that was committed at the Watergate in June of 1972. And there is Cox, and there is his successor, Leon Jaworski. On November 5th, 1973, Nixon appoints a special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and he would secure a unanimous United States Supreme Court's decision that forced Nixon to release secretly recorded tapes from the Oval Office in July of 1974. The beginning of the end. The United States is about ready to approach a constitutional crisis. Richard Nixon is up to his eyeballs in this thing. And the Republicans, he's a Republican, and the Republicans are beginning to think, hey, wait a minute. We could be up to our eyeballs if we don't get rid of him. But you can't get rid of him just because you want to get rid of him. On May 9th, the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee starts the impeachment process against Richard Nixon. And the walls are caving in. And he starts drinking and drinking and drinking. And he starts talking to George Washington and Abe Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. There are pictures all over the White House. Henry Kissinger's book, he talks about how Nixon is getting drunker and drunker and asking, Henry, how could this have happened to me? What did I do wrong? Anyway, so the walls are caving in. On July 24th, in a unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to release the tape recordings. The decision came 2 months after the White House gave the House Judiciary Committee edited transcripts of Nixon's conversations, but never turned over the actual tapes. As the New Jersey Congressman Peter Rodino, Time Magazine, the vote to impeach. Like I said, I have 4 presidents have been either impeached or almost impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached around 1868, Bill Clinton, and also Donald Trump twice, and almost this guy. 3 of the 4 I actually interviewed. 3 of the 4 I interviewed. I also knew Larry O'Brien. It's kind of amazing when I think of it, because I was just a 16-year-old kid in Spring Valley, New York in 1972. How did I get involved in all this? Luck. Anyway, so the committee sent the impeachment to the floor of a full House vote, for a full House vote. And there's Barry Goldwater and what became known as the Republican elders. Now, their job wasn't to tell Nixon, resign or else. Their job instead was to explain the facts of life to Richard Nixon and let Richard Nixon make the decision. So these guys, the elders, it's August 7th. Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona. The minority leader, John Rhodes of Arizona, and that would be in the House, and the Senate minority leader, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, go there and say, hey, look, we're not telling you to resign. You don't have to resign. You do what you want, except this is what's going to happen. You have no support up on the Hill anymore. You are going to be convicted. You are going to be removed from office in connection with the Watergate break-in. And there's Goldwater and Nixon Nixon looks a lot younger in probably happier times. Goldwater, Rhodes, and Scott didn't try to persuade or urge him to quit. They just said, nobody likes you anymore. Not that they liked him before, but at least politically, nobody likes you anymore. Well, the end is near. The drinking is getting heavier, and he is now on his knees asking Henry Kissinger what happened, and he decides it's over. It's over. Nixon decides to resign, and he gives a nationally televised address from the Oval Office on August 8th. I was in Toronto, 18-year-old kid getting through Toronto. Big news on CBC. It's all over the place in Canada. I had people asking me, are you American? I said, yeah. What do you think? Yes! He's gone. Except 11 years later, I'd be hanging out with him. Go figure. Anyway, time to say goodnight, Dick. Remember Burns and Allen?
Yeah.
Remember what George Burns said to Gracie Allen at the end of the show?
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Say goodnight, Gracie. What would she say?
Good night, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
Say goodnight, Dick. Good night, Dick. Goodbye. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interest of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with the problems we face at home and abroad. Inflation is a problem. Gas supply is a problem.
Like that.
What?
I said, I wonder who helped him write that.
I don't know. William Safire or Pat Buchanan, either one of them. They were his writers. So he has problems. He has a problem in the Middle East. He's got the Cold War, and he's right about that. They need a president to concentrate on the problems. And there I am, 1982, with a full head of hair in front of the Watergate.
Wow.
Yeah. Hair today, gone tomorrow. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. Gerald Ford would become the first president, and he was the first vice president, never to be elected to either position. He became vice president in 1973 because the vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned because of corruption. He was taking kickbacks from Leonard Matz and other construction companies in Baltimore, and while he was governor of Maryland, into the time that he was vice president of the United States. So you have at the top Nixon and Agnew. Goodbye. It's time to say goodnight, Dick. Goodnight, Dick. There he is, and he's off to San Clemente, California, never to be heard from again, which is not exactly true. There would be the David Frost interviews in 1977, and there'd be his encounter with me and others that brought him back into the limelight. It's a hello to the accidental president, Gerald Ford. You're laughing at him or Chevy Chase? So, on September 8th, Ford pardons Nixon. And he defended the action before the House Judiciary Committee, explaining he wanted to end the national divisions caused by the Watergate scandal. There were no other pardons. A total of 69 government officials were charged and 48 found guilty. Ford was criticized for giving Nixon a full pardon, but the world went on. One of the things that Nixon was referring to, Portugal. There's been an overthrow of the communist dictatorship in Portugal. That was April 25th. 200 military officers take action. They overthrow the dictator, Antonio Vieira Salazar. The officers initially called themselves the Captains Movement, which they later renamed to the Armed Forces Movement to portray the image of broader support throughout the military. Their plan? Topple the dictatorship, fully restore civil liberties, hold elections for a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, abolish the political police, find a diplomatic solution to colonial wars, like in Africa, Angola, and turn over power to democratically elected leaders. And there they are. They look really unhappy, don't they? Bloodless coup. Absolutely bloodless coup. The government collapsed. There were no executions. This guy, Willy Brandt, he was the Chancellor of West Germany, a chief American ally. And he's gone within a matter of 10 days or so. Replaced by this guy, Helmut Schmidt. On May 6th, Willy Brandt, the West Germany's chancellor, resigns. He's replaced by Schmidt. On April 24th, there was a report of an East German spy working in Brandt's West Germany government, and that would lead to his downfall. And it's Haile Selassie, and he's booted out of office in 1974. His family ran Ethiopia for 704 years. 704 years. There he is. On September 12th, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia is deposed by the Derg, or the Provisional Military Government of Socialist Ethiopia. The new government was a communist, Marxist, Leninist military junta, bringing to an end the Ptolemaic dynasty they had ruled since 1270.
Wow.
That would start the Ethiopian Civil War. So do you recognize your car in here? Anybody recognize their car in this line? I remember I was going to college. Gas went from 31 or 37 cents a gallon to 57 or 61 cents a gallon, like overnight. The gas lines. That was the result of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Did you know that? That's what happened because of the Yom Kippur War. Anyway, OPEC started an oil embargo in 1973 with the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War in October. Arab oil producers cut off exports to the U.S., which brought soaring gas prices, long lines at filling stations, and contributed to a major economic downturn in the United States, one of the things Nixon's talking about. The hope of a negotiated end to hostilities between Israel and Syria was enough to lift the embargo in March. That conflict has never ended. Never ended. It's still going on. In Greece, the military junta is thrown out. It's July 23rd. After 7 years, the Greek military rule exits, democracy returns. The military government has collapsed. The former prime minister, Konstantin Karamanlis, has been invited to return. Okay, so how many of you saw this on TV? Patty Hearst in a bank, holding a, I think it's a rifle, as the Symbionese Liberation Army robs the bank. Well, by this point, she's Tanya. Now, let me ask you a question. Did you actually care about Patty Hearst? Or were you just sucked in because it was newspaper coverage and TV coverage day after day after day after day? You know, the folk duo or rock duo, Hall & Oates, Daryl Hall and John Oates, they wrote a song called "You're a Rich Girl." Guess who that was about? Patty Hearst.
Wow.
The granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, who helped propel the United States into the Spanish-American War in 1898. You supply the war, I'll supply the pictures. Well, she was his granddaughter, and she's kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. In February, their leader, somebody by the name of Sinku. She would spend 19 months with her captor and join them in criminal acts soon after her kidnapping. She was kept in a closet, became a member of the SLA. She changed her name to Tanya. She adopted radical rhetoric, robbed the bank, went on the lam. She's finally caught by the FBI in September 1975. Hank Aaron, any baseball fans here? Yeah. Hank Aaron breaks Babe Ruth's record, April 8, 1974. He hits the home run off the former Yankee, now the Los Angeles Dodger pitcher, Al Downing. Anyway, so he breaks Ruth's 39-year record. Aaron succeeded even though he was getting mail, hate mail, in death threats, spewing outrage that a black man could supplant a white baseball icon. Hank Aaron kept every one of those letters. Every one of those letters he kept until the day he died. As far as Babe Ruth, well, when he played, there was suspicions that he had Negro blood in him. And some of the names that he was called reflected that thinking by the bench jockeys, so-called bench jockeys in the 20s and 30s. That's my father-in-law, and that's George Foreman. How many of you ended up with a George Foreman grill? My father-in-law was a groupie. I would be covering all these boxing things, and he loved the old pugs, and he would sit there and listen to them telling stories. And I was embarrassed. I used to take the pictures, but now I'm not, because I can use them in my talks. It's George Foreman against Muhammad Ali. It's Robidoux, October 30th. The Rumble in the Jungle takes place in Kinshasa, Zaire. Ali knocks George Foreman out in the 8th round to regain the heavyweight title, which had been stripped from him in April 1967 without any due process. The New York State Boxing or Athletic Association took away his license. One of the boxing groups took away his title. He refused induction in the U.S. Armed Forces on April 27, 1967 in Houston. Excuse me?
How do you refuse to be inducted?
Conscientious objector. Conscientious objector.
Was he put
Yes, and he
in
got away
prison?
with it. No.
He came back. Supreme Court ruled that he was a conscientious objector.
Yeah.
There's me and Ali, 1985. This is a sad picture because Ali was at that point speaking no louder than a whisper. All the 60,000 punches to the head got him, and the Parkinson's started kicking in. So there he is in 1985 with me in May of 1985. And look at the stare. It's just a vacant stare he has. The
Yeah.
Parkinson's had kicked in.
And his eyes are so like,
Yeah. Ali used the rope-a-dope style against Foreman. The rope-a-dope was essentially a bait and switch. Ali would feign weakness, allowing his opponent to attack him, ultimately to punch themselves out. When they had nothing left to give, Ali would spring to the attack, leave his worn-out opponent flat on their back. The problem with that was he absorbed an awful lot of punishment, and I knew his inner circle, the late Shelley Saltman, yeah, Shelley, I'm talking about you, who begged him in 1977, quit, you're going to be a vegetable. Shelley told me he did not want to work for Ali. It was 1971, I'm getting off the beaten path here, but I'll tell you the story. And Shelley was a Korean War vet, even though he was never in Korea, he was with Armed Forces Radio. And he said, I'm only working for you for the money. I don't respect you. I don't like you for what you did. And Ali said, sit down, let's talk. 3 hours later, Shelley understood exactly why Ali was against, he had nothing against the military. He just was against the Vietnam War. I'll tell you another story that Shelley told me, because he promoted Ali in 1976. There was a wrestler by the name of Inoki, Antonio Inoki in Japan. It was a boxing wrestling match in Tokyo. And basically Inoki laid on the mat and just kicked Ali for rounds upon rounds upon rounds. Well, afterwards, the doctor looked at Ali and said, you gotta go to the hospital now. You're gonna get an infection. You got to take care of it now. No. I have to go to Seoul, South Korea tomorrow. I promised the U.S. military that I would be sparring with guys and I'd be clowning around. I'm not going to let them down. When he gets to Korea, he does that. He's in the hospital by that night in critical condition. But he wanted to keep his appointment with the United States military in 1976. Story you probably never heard. Anyway, my periodontist, my dentist, my oral surgeon was very happy that I had Wrigley Spearmint, or Juicy Fruit, or Double Mint. How many of you liked any of those? But the taste would go after 15 seconds, right?
Yeah.
15 seconds, that was it. So you had to pop another one in, and then another one, and another one, and your fillings would fall out, which would lead to crowns and having teeth removed, right? Well, anyway, see this? It's a barcode.
Yeah.
It's a barcode. You go to supermarkets, you go here, there, and everywhere now, it's all about barcodes. On June 26th, a supermarket cashier scans a multi-pack of Juicy Fruit gum across a barcode scanner in Troy, Ohio. It is the first product ever checked out by the Universal Product Code. Anybody ever complete one of these?
No.
I did. But you know how I did it? I pulled it apart and put it back together. And I found out if you do that, it doesn't work. I once completed a site. Did you complete it?
My son completed it and won a prize from the local toy store.
Which store?
It's not in existence anymore, it was in Newer Shop.
In Newarship. It doesn't matter if it's not in existence anymore. That's something to be, see, now you got something to talk about at dinner with her. So your son did it?
He did it.
Did he retire from doing it after that? Did he ever do it again?
I don't remember.
But he won. What kind of toy did he win? Did he win anything good?
Pardon?
What kind of toy did he win from the toy
I
store?
don't remember.
Oh, okay. It wasn't any good anyway, if you don't remember it. Anyway, the Rubik's Cube, or the Magic Cube, is a 3D combination puzzle invented by the Hungarian sculptor and professor of architecture, Erno Rubik. It would be years before it would be sold worldwide. It was available in the United States beginning in 1980. John Lennon's last public performance is at Madison Square Garden. He is at an Elton John concert. Elton John made a bet with him about a song called Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which Elton played on. He said, if it's number one, you got to come on stage with me. It was number one, so he sung 3 songs with Elton John back in 1974, Thanksgiving at Madison Square Garden. Among the songs he sung was written by an old, estranged fiancé of mine by the name of Paul McCartney. I saw her standing there. You know, she was just 17, you know what I mean? Well, she's 79 now. The song was written in 1961, but she was just 17. The World Football League started, and this gives me a chance to talk about how I knew Grace Kelly's brother, Jack Kelly. I never asked Jack Kelly what his sister was like. If you were in my position, would you have asked Jack Kelly what Princess Grace was like, or the brother-in-law? See, I'm culturally illiterate. I don't care about these things. I really don't. I mean, I was just there to talk to Jack Kelly a couple times here and there over the years. I never asked him about Princess Grace. Does anybody remember Princess Grace under the age of 30 now?
I remember Princess Grace.
You remember her?
I don't.
Grace Kelly?
Grace Kelly.
Yeah, Grace Kelly. Nobody under the age of 30.
Married, the
Prince, yeah, the Prince of yes.
We don't know her, that's why.
Yeah, I mean, under the age of 30, I bet you people don't know who she is at all.
All of us
Anyway,
here are way past 30.
yeah, well, in the World Football League, in the first few weeks, the World Football League looked to be a success, but in Jacksonville, the Sharks ownership admitted that they gave away 40,000 tickets. And Jack Kelly's Philadelphia Bell ownership told the press, well, we gave away about 100,000 tickets, almost for nothing. 6 games into the season, the World Football League was in trouble. The Detroit Wheels, one of their owners was Marvin Gaye. Remember Marvin Gaye?
Yeah.
Heard it through the grapevine. Was looking to move to Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Orlando-based Florida Blazers to Atlanta. The Internal Revenue Service allowed the Birmingham Americans, whose owners had owed the federal government as much as $237,000 in back taxes, to play in the World Football League Championship game against the Florida Blazers at Birmingham's Legion Field in return for a share of the gate. That's the only World Football League Championship ever. After the game, sheriffs seized Orlando Blazers or Florida Blazers equipment. The American and Blazers players had not been paid in weeks, but played the game. They were convinced to stay on the field by the promise of playoff money and championship rings. It is the only time in American sports history where the sheriffs went after equipment. The other thing about the Blazer players, one player during the year said, we're not making any money. I don't even have enough money to get toilet paper. All of a sudden, shipments of toilet paper ended up with the football team. And Lucy called it quits in 1974, the end to this particular TV show, Here's Lucy. Lucille Ball's birthday is August 6th. She would be 112 years old on August 6th. Can't believe that, right? That she would have been 112. She had been on TV since 1951. Took a break after I Love Lucy ended in May of 1957. Came back in 1962. Lasted till 1974. That's it. Here's Lucy. I'm done. Oh, she's the mother of Star Trek. Did you know that?
No.
Any Star Trek fans here? Anybody watches? You watch Star Trek? Without Lucy, there's no Star Trek.
Really?
No Star Trek. She was the artistic head of Desilu. She owned the studio, a first for a woman. She greenlighted Star Trek. Nobody else wanted to put it on. She put up her own money, and it's worth how many $1 billion today? Nobody believed in it. I Love Lucy is still making Paramount money decades after the last original episode aired May 6, 1957. The show brings in, without doing anything, $20 million a year. $20 million a year, and they don't do anything except put it up. If you have Pluto TV, there's an I Love Lucy channel. You can watch all 180 episodes. You can binge watch it or watch it one at a time.
Do her children get the royalties? Or
Yes. Yes, her children, and they combined shows that Desi did.
Yeah.
So here's Lucy with some of Desi's products. So yeah, the kids get it. Lucy returned to TV in September 1986. Life with Lucy. It was a failure. ABC wanted 13 episodes. They killed it after 8 episodes. That was the Sears Tower. It's now the Willis Tower in Chicago. From the Chicago River. Do you know that they throw green dye in this river on St. Patrick's Day and the Chicago River turns green?
no.
Yeah, turns green on March 17th. Sears Tower becomes the world's tallest building. It's 108 stories, 1,451 feet, has 108 stories by standard numbers, but if you add the main roof, that becomes 109, and the penthouse mechanical stuff becomes 110. At its completion, it surpassed the World Trade Center to become the tallest building in the world. Anybody like Stephen King here? No horror fans here.
Carrie?
Carrie, no horror fans. Well, he's 26 years old, 1974. Carrie is the 4th novel he writes, but it's the first to be published. The story focused on a bullied and sheltered teenage girl who discovers she has telekinetic powers. Ultimately, using her powers to seek revenge, the novel is credited with revitalizing the horror genre. So let's wrap up 1974 in a couple minutes here. Gerald Ford was the president. Nixon, as I said, went into exile. Politically, he would return in 1985. Please call me Dick. Oh, Evan, you could call me Dick. After mediating a labor dispute between Major League Baseball owners and umpires. Ford pardoned Nixon. He would lose his presidential election bid in 1976, his first presidential campaign. Hank Aaron hit 755 home runs. Barry Bonds hit 762, but Bonds was accused, but was never proven, of taking steroids. Lucille Ball paved the way for women to be taken seriously in business, although she does not want, or did not want, that to be her legacy, according to her daughter. She wanted you to remember her as an actress. In late 1989, the Berlin Wall started to come down. The talks between East and West German officials, joined by people from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the USSR, began to explore the possibility of reunification. 2 months following the reunification, German elections took place, and Helmut Kohl became the first chancellor of reunified Germany. World Football League folded in 1975. On September 18, 1975, Patty Hearst was captured by the FBI. She's tried and convicted in March 1976 for bank robbery and felonious use of firearms. Sentenced to 7 years, she was released in February 1979 after Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence. Okay, he is remembered, George Foreman, not for winning a gold medal at the 1968 Olympics, not for being the heavyweight champion of the world. He's remembered. How many of you had this?
All of us had.
Yeah, was it any good? I still have mine. It hasn't been used in about 20 years. Somebody told me it's still on the market.
What is, wow. Wow.
It's the grill.
Foreman grill.
It's the Foreman grill.
Yeah.
It's the Foreman grill. Ali and Foreman are beloved boxing figures. Ali for his stance against the Vietnam War. And his shenanigans in and out of the ring, and Foreman became a lovable old man fighting and a commercial pitchman. John Lennon never performed live in an arena or stadium again. He was gunned down December 8, 1980. The Dirge fell in 1981. The headquarters of the African Union is in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That makes Ethiopia the diplomatic capital of Africa. The Ethiopian government has played an active and responsive role in attempting to resolve conflicts in neighboring Somalia and South Sudan. Portugal. Portugal's first free election was April 25th, 1975. There was a new constitution that was going to be written to replace the 1933 Constitution. Another election was held in 1976. First constitutional government was led by the center-leftist socialist Mario Soares, who took office. Woodward and Bernstein are still out there. They're still out there.
Oh, wow.
Mark Felt.
What are they working on?
Woodward on books and Bernstein on CNN. Mark Felt was identified as Deep Throat in 2005. He was the former Federal Bureau of Investigation Associate Director, and he was mad that he was passed over to become the FBI Director, so the rest is history. That is Robert Bork. No, it's not Robert Bork. It should be Robert Bork. How many of you watch The Simpsons? Or have kids that watch The Simpsons? Well, on October 23rd, 1987, the United States Senate rejected Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court by a roll call vote of 58-42 because of his role in Watergate. The TV show, The Simpsons Judge Roy Snyder's character, is based on Robert Bork. How many of you use the Sears mail order catalog? Anybody use the mail order catalog?
Went
No.
to the store many times.
Went to the store many times. See, before there was Amazon, long before there was Amazon, there was the Sears mail order catalog. This happened, actually, is up in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario in 2017 when I was up there, and I was watching them close Sears. Stephen King's books sold more than 350 million, have sold more than 350 million copies. The Sears Tower served as the headquarters of the retail company Sears from 1974 to 94. Sears sold the tower in 94, vacated it in 1995, retained the naming rights through 2003. It is now known as the Willis Tower. Sears was once the largest retailer in the United States. It barely exists today. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments, or do you want to know more about Richard Nixon?
No.